Hey students, one more video here. In this video, we'll take a look at introducing quantitative genetics. So we're still thinking about how do genetics play a role in producing social behaviors? But we're going to recognize that many traits, especially behavioral traits, are influenced by more than one gene. They're influenced by many genes. And so we get into the field of quantitative genetics. So let's share my screen and we will start this part of our lecture. Let's roll here. Okay, so I think we're here looking at quantitative genetics. Again, we're thinking about traits that are complex traits that are probably influenced by more than a single gene and probably also influenced by the environment. But the study of quantitative genetics is really the study of behaviors or characters that show continuous variation. Continuous variation. So if we're looking at a trait like height in the human population, we see if we were going to draw out the population of individuals that have different heights, we would get sort of a bell curve, right? Some individuals are really, really tall, few individuals are really, really short, and kind of everybody else is in the middle somewhere. Traits like this, most traits like this are influenced by many, many genes, by more than one gene, and also by the environment. But the study of quantitative genetics is a study of characters that show continuous variation and the study of the mechanisms that underlie these variations. So that's what we're trying to do if we're engaging in quantitative genetics. Hey, let's look at these really complex traits that show continuous variation. Let's try to figure out the mechanisms that underlie this variation. So let's think about a population of dogs. Let's think about our dogs for a while. They're adorable, right? My dog hasn't made a peep all morning. Don't know where she is and what she's doing. I'm in this back room making videos. What are some examples of characters or traits that show continuous variation in dogs? You can come up with a whole suite of them. Size, litter size, weight, length of the hair or type of hair, barking rate. Oh, maybe other behaviors, other personality traits like boldness or fear, curiosity, maybe intelligence or trainability. Those all would be characters that, fit our example of showing continuous variation, right? These are traits that are controlled by many genes. So you see, oops, that's kind of an oddball thing. But if we were looking at, personality and we're looking at the spectrum of, from very shy to very bold, we'd see this kind of continuous variation. How do we go about studying them? We use a lot of statistical measures that you are familiar with, most likely. We could look at the mean. On average, how tall are humans? On average, what's the barking rate of dogs or the litter size of dogs, etc. On average, what's their size? That's the mathematical average of a population. But we're also then interested in the standard deviation or the variance. And the standard deviation or variance are both measures of the spread in the data or the variability of a data set, a measure of the dispersion of a set of data points from their mean. So here we've got a picture of 3 different populations. And we see that they all have a mean of 0, it looks like. I haven't actually calculated that, but they probably do, whatever we're looking at. But there are differences in the shapes of these curves, right? In this curve right here, there's very little spread in the data. In this curve, the data are really spread out. Standard deviation and variance are two ways to measure the spread in the data set. How much variation is there really? And they're calculated, you can see the calculation for standard deviation. Basically, you're always going to compare, this is the mean, you're always going to compare the data to the mean. And the bigger your standard deviation, the more spread we see in the data. A variance is another measure of that dispersion or spread, except it's the square of the standard deviation. And you can see that that's the case here. In any case, we can look at the mean in the population. We can look at the spread of the data, or the standard deviation, or the variance in the population in terms of this behavior, the variance in height, or the variance in bark rates, or the variance in curiosity across our dog populations, right? And when we're studying a behavioral trait that shows continuous variation, we will start asking these questions. We'll say, is the variation that we see in this character of curiosity in dogs at all influenced by genetic variation, by variations in their genes, by genetic variation? Are there some variations in the genes contributing to the variation we see in this behavior? And if so, how important is the genetic variation to the overall phenotypic variation? The phenotypic variation would be the variation in the trait, what it looks like. We see that some dogs are hyper curious. We see that some dogs aren't curious at all. We see this whole spread of curiosity. That would be the phenotypic variation. How important is the genetic variation to this phenotypic variation? That's what we're trying to figure out. Is there a relationship? And how do both the genes combine with and interact with the environment to contribute to the phenotype? How do the genes combine and interact with the environment to contribute to the behavioral phenotype? That's what we're interested in if we're studying quantitative genetics. Can we somehow determine how much of the phenotypic variation is determined by genetics, by variation in the genes? That's what we're kind of interested in, is if we're thinking about, is this trait something that's passed along? Is it somehow, do genes somehow contribute to the variation we see in this trait? That's what we're trying to sort out. And we're going to calculate what's called the heritability to sort out the extent to which variation in a trait can be attributed to variation in genetics. Heritability, that's really, we should write that down, the extent to which variation in a trait can be attributed to variation in genetics. So you can write that down, can be attributed to variation in genetics. Wow, this is bad. You get the hang of it, right? So heritability, we're trying to calculate the extent to which the variation in the trait can be attributed to variation in the genes. Okay, we know some things already. So let's look at this. We're going to use the big letter V to represent variance, and we can think of that as that spread in the data. The phenotypic variance, that's what pH stands for, the phenotypic variance is equal to the variance due to genetics plus the variance due to the environment, VG and VE. The phenotypic variance is the variance due to genetics plus the variance due to the environment. The variance due to genetics can be further subdivided. We're not worried too much about these subdivisions, but think of things like variance due to additive genes, variance due to dominance and epistasis, and interactions between genes and environment. So that's what all these little guys stand for. But basically we're thinking, look, phenotypic variance we see out there in the population in our dogs is equal to the variance due to genetics plus the variance due to the environment and then what experiences they've had. Makes sense. Here's the deal though. This term heritability has a very specific definition, and it is the proportion of phenotypic variance that is caused by genetics. The proportion of phenotypic variance that is caused by, or that is due to, genes or genetics. And we define heritability in two ways. We either give it a big H or we sometimes give it a little h squared. There's slightly different definitions. One of them is called heritability in the broad sense. One is in the narrow sense. We're not going to worry too much about this, but it's really the heritability is equal to the variation due to genetics divided by the total phenotypic variation. What proportion of this phenotypic variation is due to genetics? Due to variation in genes. That's a better way to say it. So if we're thinking of a proportion, what's heritability going to range from? From 0 to 1, right? A heritability of 0 would suggest that when we look around and we see this phenotypic variation, none of the variation in the phenotype is due to variation in the genes. If you get a heritability of 1, you would say, wow, we're looking at all of this phenotypic variation, and all of the phenotypic variation is, in fact, due to variation in genes or variance due to genetics. Okay. Let me quick give you an example of a situation in which you might get 0 heritability. So suppose we have a population of 50 people, and they all have their hair dyed. They dyed their hair different colors, greens and purples and pinks and oranges, all different shades of dyed hair. So there's variation in the population with respect to hair color because everyone has different colored dyes. There's variation in hair color. When we start picking away at that, we will soon recognize that none of this variation that we see in dyed hair colors in this population is due to variation in genetics. It's all due to variance due to the environment. What hair color dye they chose to use, right? So we could come up with a heritability of 0. A heritability of 1 represents all of the variation we see is due to genetic variation. Yeah, that's harder to find examples for. How do we measure heritability? What measures do we take? Well, we can do a couple of things. We could estimate the components of variance by minimizing one component. What does that even mean? So, for example, we could come up with genetically identical animals, a strain of mice that are genetically identical that we're going to use in some research, and put them into different environmental conditions. All right, we're going to take these genetically identical mice and we're going to expose them to different kinds of environments when they're young, like one that's very stimulating, has lots of toys in it, have lots of different adventures they can go on, and one that's very boring. And then later in life, we're going to look at some behavioral trait. We're going to look at curiosity, or we're going to look at fear, or we're going to look at aggression or something like that. And any variation we find then is not due to variation in the genes because they're all genetically identical, but is due to then variation in their earlier environment, perhaps. That's one way to do it. By the way, this is a picture of armadillos. Turns out that the 9-banded armadillos, this is just a little trivia that you guys can take home with you. The 9-banded armadillo species always has a litter of 4 pups, and they are genetically identical quadruplets. They always have 4 genetically identical quadruplets when they have a litter. Isn't that cute? So you would have these genetically identical animals that you could put in different environments and estimate how important is the environment to the behavior, right? Or you could do the opposite. Take some genetically different animals, a whole bunch of different cows, and put them in identical conditions. Raise them, with exactly the same diet, with the same, you know, uh, t- uh, conditions in the day, when you go out to pasture or when you come back in, when we milk you, the exact time of day. We're not going to change any of that. We're going to put them in identical conditions and then look at variation in behavior and say, any variations we see in the behavior or in the trait, in the amount of milk that you produce, or in your aggression, or in your fear of handling, whatever. The amount of variation that we see in this behavior is got to be due to variation in genetics, because we've kept everything else identical. So you can measure heritability, or you could start estimating the proportion of phenotypic variance that's due to genetic variance by doing one of these two things. You could also measure similarities between relatives. This one is fun. We know things about relatives. We know on average what proportion of their genes they share. So here's another way to measure heritability that's been used. You compare the amount of similarity between relatives in a trait, like let's just go with height, for example, to the expected similarity between relatives due to their similarity in genes, if the trait is 100% heritable. So let's, for example, think about height in humans. If you have identical twins, they share almost all their genes. Let's go with 100% of their genes. We would expect identical twins to be the same height if the trait of height is 100% heritable. We would expect 100%. We would expect them to always be the same height, right? In order to measure heritability, we could look at a population of, let's say, height and identical twins, and we could use what are called correlation coefficients. If we were going to measure identical twins' heights and put the height of one twin on the x-axis, the height of the second twin on the second axis, and we measure a whole bunch of individuals, we would expect a perfect correlation between the height of one identical twin and his partner. We would expect a correlation of 1. That's called R equal to 1. That's down here, a perfect correlation. Okay. If the characteristic of height is 100% heritable. If it's less than 100% heritable, we might not get a perfect correlation. And you can see different correlation values, different R values here. You can see there's more and more scatter. With a correlation of 0, we have basically dots everywhere. With a low positive correlation, you get a value of maybe 0.5 or 0.4, something like that. Okay, then we use our correlation coefficient that we've just calculated to calculate heritability in the narrow sense. The calculation of heritability is equal to the observed correlation divided by the expected correlation in terms of similarities in genes. Okay. Let me give you another example that's a little harder. Suppose we're looking at height between parents and children. All right. So we go out and we collect a population of data, and we get parent height and child height, and we put parent height on the x-axis, child height on the y-axis, and we come up with a correlation. And we go, okay, our observed correlation is 0.4. That's our observation, that they're pretty correlated, right? By definition, heritability is equal to the observed correlation divided by our expected correlation. Yeah. So 0.4 divided by something. What is our expected correlation? Our expected correlation, for that we have to know what percent of the genes do parents and children share. on average. Parents and children should share 50% of their genes. Their expected correlation then should be 0.5. They should share. If the trait is 100% heritable, we should have an expected correlation here of 0.5, but we had an expected correlation of 0.4. So now to calculate heritability, we simply take 0.4 divided by 0.5, that's what we expected, and get 0.4, that's 4/5, that's 80%, or 0.8. A heritability of 0.8. That's really high. Heritability of 0.8 means like 80% of the variation in phenotype is due to variation in genes. That's what it tells me, that heritability of height is pretty significant. It's pretty high. And in fact, the heritability of height is pretty significant. It is close to like 0.75 or 0.8. That was a pretty accurate description. So we can use this kind of trick to get a feeling for heritability. To get a feeling for the proportion of genetic variation the proportion of total phenotypic variation that's due to genetics, or that's due to variation in genetics. And guess what? That's what researchers start to do. And they start to kind of hone in on or capitalize on genetic relatedness. So, hey, let's look at monozygotic. That would be identical twins. They're 100% related. Oh, let's compare them maybe to fraternal twins or siblings that only share 50% of their genes. Oh, parents and children share 50% of their genes. We know the genetic relatedness between relatives. We also can get estimates of the environmental similarities. If you're an identical twin, you're probably raised in a pretty similar environment if you're raised together. I mean, your parents are the same age, your parents have, you live in the same house, you go to the same school, most likely, you probably have, the same kinds of exposure to books and to museums and things of that nature. On the other hand, the parent-child relationship is kind of interesting because genetically they share 50% of their genes, but maybe less similarities in their environment. My mom and I certainly didn't share that much. My mom grew up in Rotterdam during World War II. She was incredibly starved, basically, and lived in a very impoverished situation. I lived in a much more middle-class environment. Next time, we're going to talk about twins and twin studies, why they're useful for studying heritability, and we'll finish this lecture later. I think that's it. I'm ready to quit. All right, the end.